a lot of natural resources in the state, a lot of resources that could be extracted, processed, and used for the general good, not just of Alaska, but the rest of the world. But we're unable to do it because of the unavailability of local energy. So we do have a vision of a statewide Alaskan grid, one that would serve not just the rail belt communities, but would serve our production facilities of the North Slope, dozens of mines across the state that are gasping for energy and will not start up without affordable energy, and for heat and power for rural communities. So this is just a hypothetical look at what a transmission grid could look like. Only a very small portion of that currently exists today. This was actually a study that was done for the Denali Commission in 2008, which is now, goodness, 5 years ago, and is being worked on now to refine that. But we compete with a lot of other projects that typically tend to rise to the surface because they're politically more acceptable than a project of this nature. But we are making progress with it, and so I'm hopeful that we're going to have some transmission grid in the foreseeable future. And I just gave David a gift of catching up with some time, so I think we have time for a few questions.
Thank you. Jim, do you want to come to the microphone? Okay.
I'm just wondering what is your cost per mile of running? You're trying to build a grid at 135 or some, kV. What is your cost per mile, and how do you possibly pay that with that small customer base?
Well, the grid has several elements to it. The interconnection of the villages themselves is going to be at your conventional AC distribution levels, which is basically 25 kV or 12.5 kV. Our statewide grid, we envision as being an HVDC grid, operated at 500 kV to 1,000 kV, because you're going to be moving very, very large loads. The North Slope, for example, is arguably a 3 gigawatt load once you connect all of those production areas. Mines, typically, you're looking at somewhere between 100 megawatts to 350 megawatts in size. And so what happens is by building an HVDC grid, you are able to bring power to major hubs and then potentially hook into those hubs at the converter station with AC. It's ambitious.
Yes.
If you look at what happened with rural electrification in the lower 48 in the 30s through the 50s, small wind plants did a perfectly adequate job for small loads, and it got to the point where the grid was expanded, not because it was a good idea economically or for engineering purposes, but just because it became politically the right thing to do. I'm just wondering, what's the motivation here for a statewide grid when it seems to me that small distributed loads can meet the needs of the remote villages perfectly adequately?
Well, if you look at the fact that households are spending 60, 50, 60, 70% of their income on energy, that is crippling our villages. It is causing an out-migration from the villages. So I don't know about standalone operations that are able to function fully, reliably. In this modern day and age, people want reliable power, and they want high-quality power. And you're not able to develop that in a very micro hybrid, I guess a hybrid system. The state has a couple of places where they've actually looked at this, they have done this. An example in point is a community called Lime Village. It's a village of about 45 or 50 people, and they have a hybrid solar, wind, diesel battery system that has had to be replaced several times in the last 20 years at enormous cost. And at some point in time, you go, what price makes it acceptable to support an individual household? Because the cost of energy is so high, there's no commerce of any kind. So there's really no businesses, there's no jobs. So yeah, I mean, it is technically possible to subsist on a standalone island for a single home or a single small business, but it's not adequate to sustain economic life.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Has there been any policy movement, it seems, with the resource wealth that Alaska has, that you may have, some cross-subsidization, or I know that's probably a very hot topic. Can you give us some background on that?
Well, something I didn't mention in this particular presentation, but I co-chaired a study group of an organization called Commonwealth North, which is a policy think tank that's headquartered here in Anchorage. And we produced a report last year that was presented to not just Commonwealth North, but many different foray and the legislature and so forth, that basically talks about the directions that we need to go in to establish an energy security in the state. And there are other concepts that have been in the works for some time. For example, the state has pursued a regional planning approach with the concept that the state is too large to deal with as one big chunk, and we need to carve it up and then deal with it on a regional basis. The problem is that the regional model encompasses regional transmission and then some sort of central generation, hopefully something like hydropower or geothermal, but the combined loads in those small communities simply don't justify billions of dollars of investment on a regional basis. This particular concept is arguably the least expensive overall to serve the entire state. But it takes time for such things to come to the surface. Other projects have to sort of fall by the wayside along the way, or it has to be demonstrated that this is what's going to make them viable. For example, the state is currently pursuing a hydro project on the Susitna River. And it's a 600 megawatt project, which will, because of obviously winter-summer issues, it'll produce at about 315 megawatts on average on a year-round basis. And in order for them to be able to move that power to the power centers, which is Anchorage, Fairbanks, the Valley, you're going to have to upgrade the transmission system to the tune of about $1 billion. So you get a $5 billion 600 megawatt project, $5 billion 300 megawatt project, and $1 billion transmission project. You put them together, and that $6 billion could just about build across Alaska generation and grid system. The drawback is that we're talking about natural gas fire generation, and obviously that's not necessarily renewable, but when you're building it in the scale that we're talking about, which is a multi-gigawatt scale, you're able to achieve 60+% efficiencies of natural gas. And you're doing it in an airshed that's really quite pristine, so it's not, it's also 10 times the size of the Susitna project.
Yes.
What is your estimate of the percentage of the population in Alaska with living in a microgrid system? Just to get an idea of.
Well, as I pointed out, the population of Anchorage is about 300,000, and so if you take the interconnected grid, which is Fairbanks, the Matanuska Valley, Anchorage, Homer, and Seward, that comprises about 75% of the population of Alaska. And then you have Southeast Alaska, which is the Juneau, Ketchikan, Sitka, and then all the isolated communities beyond that. So rural Alaska in and of itself is only about maybe 12% of the population. And I was asked a question about the cost per mile, and I can tell you what our experience has been building distribution systems to join our villages, and that runs anywhere from $250,000 per mile to about $400,000 per mile. When we're looking at the HVDC grid system, You're looking at somewhere in the region of $1.8 million a mile for the 2 gigawatt or the 2,000 kV transmission, and then multiples down there. So a 500 kV system runs about $1.25 million a mile. And that's just taking the Canada experience and adding 25% because Alaska is just more difficult politically. Thank you. I appreciate the attention.
Well, we come to the last session, and my task is to talk about the European experience with supporting wind, particularly in my country, Britain. Right, here we go. So I'll briefly talk about what it is we're trying to do with the support of renewables and wind in particular, look at some European experience of the different ways of doing that, and ask how should we be doing it if we wanted to do it at least cost, and then look at how we actually do it in the UK, and try and evolve some better way of doing what we're trying to do. So the European Union passed a directive, a renewable directive, the so-called 20-20-20, 20% of renewable energy and 20% improvement efficiency and 20% reduction of carbon dioxide, all by 2020. Sounds good. And the logic of the renewables part of that is to try and, by deploying them at scale, drive down the costs. That will induce investment, which will generate learning benefits. And the problem of producing these spillover public goods is how do you collectively finance them? And I think the smart part of the directive is that it has successfully found a way of dividing the burden amongst the various member states. And all of the countries separately have to contribute to this goal. Now, if we ask, where does the learning come from, especially with a fairly mature technology like wind, the answer is, obviously, we're trying to improve the design, and there's been quite an improvement in reliability and performance, and controllability, and integrating them into the grid. And obviously, we're learning a lot about where best to site them in terms of wind and availability and grid connections, and integrating them into the grid. But all of those have to do with the investment stage. They don't have anything to do, once you've made all those decisions, you just run the turbine, and they're pretty reliable. So you don't want to support the running, you want to support the earlier stages of the development, but that's not what we do. The evidence for learning benefits, I think, is still fairly strong. You can see PV is the one that has had the most dramatic improvements in cost. So every time you double the scale, you reduce the cost by 35%. Wind power, you reduce it by 18%. But these are slightly out-of-date figures. But if we update them, PV in particular, the amazing thing is, and these are log scales, that the learning progress continues. They're still pretty expensive, but the rate at which they're coming down is apparently very impressive. The only drawback is that when you're going from 10 to 100 megawatts, that's not very expensive, and you get a big learning benefit. When you go from 100 to 1,000, it's getting a bit more expensive. When you go from 1,000 to 10,000 and up to 100,000, you're talking seriously large sums of money. So those learning benefits come at an increasing cost. But that is the motive behind trying to deploy these at increasing scale. What's happened? One of the consequences of electricity liberalisation has been the collapse of research and development, which used to be done, especially in state-owned enterprises where engineers call the shots. Once the financiers take over, that sort of money disappears. The Renewables Directive has forced each country to essentially step up the rate at which they're supporting deployment, if not research. And that's up to 2010. You can see a pretty steep rise. That will go on pretty steadily for the next 10 years at least. So, what do we have to worry about in the case of wind? In Britain, we get about a 25% capacity factor onshore, 36% offshore. I'm always impressed in Texas how they get 36% onshore. We would love that wind resource, but we're still pretty good compared to the rest of Europe. The consequence is that if you have a windy site, you do very well if you get the same price per kilowatt hour as a less windy site. Obviously, this is variable and it's unpredictable, and that has challenges for providing the necessary flexible reserve capacity, and it also creates various problems in terms of going to market, because if when you sell your power you don't know how much power you're going to produce, then you're exposed to an imbalance risk. And these characteristics have to be recognized in the way we support them if we want to support them at a low cost. I'll skip over that, but just point out that there is a huge variation in the capacity factor of the wind farms that we have already installed. And you can see that if we look at Britain, quite a lot of it is better than 25%. Some of it's really good. There are some dogs out there, I guess they just chose the wrong places. And in Scotland, which is where the wind is even better, it's a much smaller country, but they're also getting a very substantial amount of wind at capacity factors that are really quite impressive. It's very variable month to month. You can see the summer is very low compared to the winter. That's fortunate. We're a winter peaking system. There's really substantial variation from year to year. And of course, there's huge variation over the course of the 24 hours. We're also lucky, especially compared to California. If you look at the load, oh, this is really a challenge to dexterously incapable people, but the load over the day is like this, and the wind, fortunately, is peaking in the period of the day when we actually need the power. So this is actually quite an attractive solution compared to California, where it comes in the early hours of the night. So what do we have to worry about? We have a whole bunch of market failures. We're trying to deploy renewables to mitigate climate change. We unfortunately have a system in which carbon dioxide is underpriced. We have learning benefits. We have to try and capture those. And I'm going to say that we have to deal with the problem of risk. I'll illustrate these sequentially. So pricing carbon dioxide is always challenging politically because it raises energy prices. The industrialists get upset. Nevertheless, because the emissions trading system has essentially failed, we in Britain have adopted a carbon price floor for the electricity sector to get the carbon price up to a level at which it makes sense for mature technologies. The issue of what are the learning benefits, I'm going to come back to that. How exactly do we best support those at least cost? And what about the risks? Well, that's an issue, obviously, with contract design. And I'll illustrate there's the emissions trading system, which started out so well and has collapsed so rapidly. We have addressed that by having an extra corrective tax, which is intended essentially by the end of the decade to get up to the point at which nuclear power stations ought to be reasonably comfortable. We have interesting characteristics in that fossil generation burns either coal or gas, and you can see these are forward prices for 2010 baseload delivery, trading from 2007 up until shortly before the delivery year. And you will see that when you add in the carbon price to the gas to get the clean spark spread and sell at the electricity price, which is the top one, the prices are extremely volatile, but the spark spread isn't actually all that volatile. As the gas price goes up, so the electricity price goes up. As the coal price goes up, so the electricity price goes up. The coal and gas cost of generation are actually quite highly correlated. So fossil generation is naturally hedged, but if you're a wind farm, you face the full volatility of that final price. And that, of course, is a challenge in terms of financing. So what different countries have come up with is a variety of forms of contracts, and the Three that I want to look at are feed-in tariffs, where you fix the price of the megawatt hours that are supplied to the grid. A premium feed-in tariff is you pay a fixed premium on top of whatever price you get in the wholesale market, or the British always like to be different, so we have a contract for difference, where you have a reference price, which will be the wholesale price the hour of the day ahead, and you get paid the difference between that and the strike price, which is high enough to support the technology. And if you're selling at a wholesale price which is higher than the strike price, then you have to pay the money back. So you lock in a price ahead of time, in our case for 15 years. That's not the only thing you have to worry about. You're dealing with the risk in the wholesale market, but you also want to find out, you want to give signals for where the plant should locate, and we want to find the best way of providing the money that's delivering these earning benefits. So if we look across Europe, we find that Germany, Spain and Denmark, and those are significant countries in terms of adoption, have chosen the feed-in tariff. And that has the property that it transfers all the risk to the transmission system operator. In most of these countries, it is the same price regardless of where you locate, so it gives you no incentive to take into account the costs of the transmission system. You just want to go where the wind is. It's been remarkably successful in delivering improved penetration. And then the question is, well, if you go to a windy place and you're going to potentially make a lot of profit, if you get the same price as a less windy place, how do you capture that rent? And Germany has been extremely successful by measuring your first 3 years' output, and then the length of your contract depends upon the strength of your wind resource. So if you're going to get all your money back in 10 years, you get a 10-year contract. If it takes you 20 years to get the money back, you get a 20-year contract. And that way, the consumers don't pay too much for the lucky people who get the good resource. We in Britain, of course, have tried a whole variety of things. We started off very promisingly with auctions in the 90s. We then switched to what is effectively a premium feed-in tariff. It's the renewable obligation certificate. It's traded, so its price depends on the supply and demand of these certificates. The demand is created by an obligation on the distribution companies. And we've now chosen a contract for difference. We do address the issue of differential transmission costs by having locational transmission charges. But we do give a single price regardless of where you're located. So we can look and see how do these different supports compare. One thing to bear in mind is that the darker the colour, the better the wind, and Britain and especially Scotland are very good compared to the continent. And you will see Germany, except